Someone tried to break into my house and find me. This story happened about 3 to 4 years ago, around the time that COVID started, so it was a little while back. It was early 2020, and I had just gotten a new job in a small town near my area. While looking for a place to live, my sister offered to rent her house to me. She had bought the house 2 years prior, but she and her husband didn't really take to it, and their commute to work was long, so they moved out and the house was uninhabited. Luckily for me, it was actually pretty close to my workplace, and my sister practically rented it out to me for free. I just paid for the water and electricity and looked after the house. I was living there for a solid 2 or 3 months and had already gotten used to it. One night, after coming back from work and parking my car, I walked towards my door and noticed something odd. There was a cigarette butt on the curb to my house. I leaned down and picked it up, thinking that it might have been mine since I am a smoker. But after looking at the brand name, I realized that this wasn't mine and tossed it. I figured some asshole threw it at my curb. I went on with my night and nothing unusual happened. 2 days later, I was once again walking to my house when I spotted a few more cigarette butts, this time near my porch. Needless to say, I was pissed off and thought that someone sat on my porch and smoked, but since I didn't know who it could have been, there was nothing I could do about it. However, I did notice that they were put out recently, so whoever it was probably walked off as I was approaching. Later that night, I started watching a movie on my laptop. It was pretty late when I heard a car passing by. Now, this was a rather secluded development in a suburban neighborhood, and remember, this is during peak COVID, so people rarely ventured out at night. Around half an hour later, I was surprised when I heard chattering nearby. I listened intently, but I couldn't hear what they were talking about as their voices seemed almost muffled. By this point, I was getting a bit unnerved, so I stopped the movie and quietly got off my sofa and walked to the front door to make sure that it was locked. As I was approaching the door, I froze mid-step as I heard the two approaching my porch and reducing their talking to a whisper. I realized right away that whoever this was wanted to break in. I leaned against my front door and waited, expecting a loud bang against the door or the doorknob being shaken, but it was oddly quiet. I decided to walk over to my window to see if they had walked away or changed their mind. My windows have bars from the inside that you have to unlock so that you can move the curtains or look out the window comfortably. I slowly unlocked the bar mechanism and lifted it up. I moved the curtains and was stunned. Leaning up against my window was a man. He was as startled as I was. He tightened his hoodie to cover his face, so all I could really see were his big blue eyes glaring at me. His friend realized what was going on and right away started to kick the door in. He kicked it a solid 4 or 5 times, but the door wouldn't budge. All the while, I was staring at them, frozen in fear and trying to comprehend the situation. I snapped out of it and slammed the bars over my window, locking them and running upstairs to the storage room, where I barricaded the door with a table and called the cops. As I listened and expected the two to come inside any minute, I heard a loud crash and the bars from the window being shaken aggressively. When they realized they couldn't get in, one of them let out a long, irritated scream that probably woke up half the neighborhood. And by the time the cops came, they were long gone. The police couldn't find out who they were, but they were more active in the neighborhood in the following weeks. Regardless, I wasn't too keen on staying there, so shortly after, I moved out. My sister sold the house a few months later, and as far as I know, nothing similar ever happened since. Two men posed as cable providers to attempt to break in, or worse. This happened several years ago. I was home alone one evening when I heard a knock at the back door. This confused me as no one ever used that door. My husband and I lived in a fourplex at the time, and all of the units had a back door at the top of a narrow staircase. And these doors were a little inconvenient to access, as you'd have to go around the building and up the narrow stairs as opposed to just the main entrance at the front. It didn't make sense to use the back entrance, and I couldn't think of anyone who would go to that door to visit. As I approached the back door, I saw two tall men in the window. I didn't feel safe opening the door, so I called out, "Hello?" One of the men tapped on the window. "Yes, hello. May we come in? We're here with Bresnan." At the time, my husband and I had Bresnan for cable, but didn't have any issues with it. I replied, "We're not having any issues. Is there a problem?" "Ma'am," the man said, "can we come in? We're servicing the area and it's important we look at your cable." I shook my head. "We're not having any issues," I repeated, "so there's no need to stop by." "Ma'am, we're visiting every resident. Let us in so that we can do our job." I noticed the man grab the doorknob and try to open the locked door. I slowly grabbed a knife from the kitchen and held it at my chest. "We're not having any issues," I repeated, trying not to convey shakiness of my voice. "So you don't need to be here." The two figures appeared to shuffle and then straighten. "Ma'am, let us in. We're on a deadline and need to do our job." I glanced at the clock, gauging when my husband would arrive home from work. I gripped the knife tighter. "Ma'am." I saw him try the doorknob again. I closed my eyes and felt overwhelming relief that it was locked. Just then, a thought came to the forefront of my mind. "I'm sorry I can't help you. Could I please get your names and info? I can give your supervisor a call to let them know our cable is fine." I heard another shuffle and one of the men replied, "No need to, ma'am. We're sorry for wasting your time." With that, both of the men exited the staircase and disappeared into the night. Shaken up, I held the knife tight and tried to get my bearings. I remember making a mental note to call the cable company or the police, but my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't hold the phone. With the knife still held against my chest and the phone falling out of my other hand, I sank to the floor and cried. When my husband returned home, I told him what had happened. I was still very shaken up and had started crying after he came home. He immediately called the Bresnan Cable Company and spoke to a representative. They informed us that no one from their company was out on assignment in our area. The next day, we asked our neighbors if they had a visit from the company as well, and no one else had. Home invasion turned creepy. I live on a farm out in the middle of nowhere. My closest neighbor is a half-mile away. I work night shift, so sleeping during the day is something you learn to get used to. Around 6 to 7 p.m., I heard what I thought was a loud knocking sound coming from outside and my dogs going absolutely ballistic. I somewhat wake up but don't really think anything of it since my neighbors like to shoot their guns and this was during hunting season. As I start falling back asleep, my heart started fluttering weird, like I knew something wasn't right. That's when I heard loud footsteps throughout the house. The dogs are still barking but start to quiet down. The footsteps stop on the other side of my bedroom door. It's silent now. I think, this is how I'm gonna die. And although I had a weapon in my room, I knew I couldn't get to it without being heard. It felt like an eternity trying to stay quiet until I heard the steps move towards my brother's room. Rustling can be heard loudly throughout the house with things being thrown. I knew they were in my brother's room. Some of his friends are into seedy situations and I knew it had to be one of them. I heard the footsteps coming back to my door and the doorknob handle moves. I immediately turned back towards the door and closed my eyes tight with a hand over my mouth to stop myself from screaming. The door opens, but that's it. Then he leaves as a car drives down the road. I finally bucked up my courage and got out of bed. Everything in the house except for my brother's room was undisturbed. I immediately called my brother and asked if any of his friends were coming over, and he said not that he knew of, and I told him what happened. We got off the phone and I went back to bed. I noticed that I still had my window cracked open from earlier and realized I was only wearing a t-shirt to bed, and if it was who I think it was, This wasn't a random event, and the fact that they saw me sleeping in just a shirt freaks me out. Whether or not they took something from the house or knew I was home alone sleeping,